A 14-year-old girl on the streets of Houston. She was abducted by two individuals. There was a fat guy and a skinny guy. They went to the skinny guy's house in the fat guy's car. When they got to the skinny guy's house, the skinny guy's brother was sitting on the couch and watched the two of them take her into a bedroom where they raped her. Then the fat guy and the skinny guy came out. They had a hood over her head. They dropped her off at a 7-Eleven. She starts wandering around. She finds a police officer. She gives a description of the skinny guy and the skinny guy's home. The police officer immediately realizes it's a man named Beltrain. He also knows Beltrain has an acquaintance named George Rodriguez, who he thinks might be the fat guy, although he checks out Rodriguez's alibi for that day and sees that he's working. Excuse me. Nonetheless, they show a photo array involving George Rodriguez's picture to the victim. She picks him out. They arrest him. They look at pubic hairs that are found at the scene in the bed. They say microscopically they come back consistent with George Rodriguez. They arrest Beltrain. Beltrain says, wait a second. I committed this crime, but I didn't do it with George Rodriguez. I did it with a man named Isidore Yanez. And then they talk to Beltrain's brother, and he says, yes, it's Isidore Yanez. He's the guy that did it. And they identify the car that she was abducted in. It's the car of Isidore Yanez. The police look up something about Isidore Yanez. There's another abduction, rape of two women in Houston, where a co-defendant is saying, I did it, pleads guilty, but I did it with Yanez, who kind of coerced me into the whole thing, although the victims don't identify Yanez, so he skates on that case. So now they decide to prosecute Rodriguez. Rodriguez has a defense. He says Yanez did it, right? I guess he calls the brother. The brother said, I was there. My brother committed the crime with Yanez. It's Yanez's car. The serologist gets on the stand. The serologist says, aha, we have semen from a rape kit. And we do serological testing in those days, this is 20 years ago, of the semen, because people, 80% of people secrete blood group substances into their saliva or semen or vaginal discharge. And so when they take a rape kit from a crime scene, they were able to say, are you blood type A, blood type O? If you're a secretor, are you AB? And such analysis was done. And in this particular case, they found George Rodriguez was a non-secretor, so he could never be excluded, because he could have been a semen donor, but you couldn't tell because he's a non-secretor. The victim is blood group A and is a secretor, and then Yanez is blood group O. So those of you that are taking any kind of fundamental serology or science know that if you're blood group A, that means you have both the A antigen and some of the H antigen. If you're blood group O, you have two H antigens. It is a fundamental rule of serology that if you have a mixed stain, and one of the contributors, the female victim in this case, is an A, and somebody else is an O secretor, you cannot exclude the O secretor as a potential contributor. That's fundamental. That's black letter. That is undisputed. The head of the Houston Serology Lab, Bolding, came into court and testified that he could exclude Yanez because he was an O secretor. It's just wrong. Did the defense lawyer know that this was wrong? No. Did the defense lawyer consult an expert? No. Did the prosecutor do anything? No. Did the prosecutor know? No. In other cases, had Bolding testified to the opposite when he wanted to include somebody? Yes. It just happened. And they were able to say to the jury, Yanez cannot be scientifically, he can't be included. So finally we were able to go back and do DNA testing. We did DNA testing on the hairs. Needless to say, the pubic hairs did not come from Rodriguez. They were consistent with Yanez. We couldn't get our hands on the semen, but we got affidavits from all the leading serologists on the planet saying, number one, this was wrong. Number two, there has to be an investigation of every case this guy was involved in the Houston Police Department Crime Lab, because it was such a blatant scientific mistake. They then went back and looked, retyped everybody's blood, and they found out that Yanez was himself a non-secretor. They just mistyped him. That's how bad it was. So George Rodriguez his conviction was vacated, the charges against him were dismissed, and the City of Houston finally convened a huge audit of their crime lab, and under the direction of Michael Bromwich, who was a former Inspector General of the United States who did the FBI investigation, which led to their accreditation. They're now doing a huge reconstruction review of everything in the Houston Crime Lab. Now, why is that so important? Well, we've had crime lab scandals like this in West Virginia, a man named Fred Zane. It's written all about in our book, Actual Innocence. In Oklahoma City, similar fraud was discovered with a woman named Joyce Gilchrist. These are sometimes people that weren't even doing the tests. In Montana, there was Arnold Melnikoff, who ran the Montana Crime Lab for years. And I could go on and on. We have a lot of this, unfortunately, in our country. And I support forensic science. I work hand in hand. Peter Neufeld and I regulate the crime labs in the state of New York for the last 14 years. I know many wonderful forensic science, and I support them in cleaning up their profession. Lord knows we got plenty of bad lawyers, right? Plenty of them. So, I don't want to just cast aspersions, but we have a serious problem. But why do I bring up Houston? Because Houston is in Harris County. And the Houston Police Department Crime Lab was doing the ballistics, the serology, the trace evidence, even some DNA testing for Harris County, jurisdictions in Harris County. Do you know what Harris County is famous for? Harris County has executed more people in this country than any jurisdiction except the state of Texas itself and the state of Virginia. So that is about all you need to know about some of the difficulties we have on the issue of capital punishment here in the United States. Let me assure you that reasonable people can differ about whether or not the death penalty is the morally appropriate sanction for the most heinous of crimes. Some people think that's why society's saying, we condemn this action, this terrible crime. Others, Catholic Church, religious leaders, and others believe that for the state to kill, it undermines the civilized and social fabric of your community. So reasonable people can differ on that issue. But I'll tell you where reasonable people can't differ. You cannot take the position that you're in favor of capital punishment but have an unfair system in its administration. You cannot take the position that it's okay to have lawyers that can't do the job, who don't have experts and aren't properly defending their clients, even to get life verdicts in cases. You can't say that that's good. And the one thing that you really can't say is that you're executing more people than any jurisdiction in the United States, and you can't have a crime lab that gets one thing right and is still under essentially receivership and investigation. That is an outrage. And that is something that no citizen should stand still or accept. And that is the problem we have when you consider the issue of capital punishment. And I would say it is really not worth the money, given that there is no proven deterrent effect, for any of you to think about bringing it back here to the state of Iowa. All right, last thing, fingerprints. I told you about the problems in fingerprints. Let me tell you about two more cases and I'll quit. Next slide. Here's my friend Stefan Cowens. Envision a Mystic River neighborhood. Remember the movie Mystic River in Boston? One day there's a police officer walking down the street. He looks into a park. He sees a young black man with a baseball hat pulled to the side. The guy looks a little suspicious. He feels like, I better go investigate. He walks towards him. The young black man runs away. All of a sudden, he catches him. A fight ensues. The black man grabs the gun, shoots him in the back. Thankfully, the officer is wearing a bulletproof vest. The young man drops his hat in the park, scales a wall, runs down an alleyway. He jumps into an apartment. Three African Americans, a mom and two kids are there. He's got a gun in his hand. He says, "Give me a glass of water." So they give him a glass of water, right? He's got a gun. He drinks the water, he puts it down on the table, he pulls off his sweatshirt, he wipes fingerprints from the gun, he leaves the gun in the sweatshirt in the place and leaves. It's a cop shooting case. It's a real hot one. They start looking around the neighborhood for anybody that might fit the description of a young black man who wears a baseball hat to the side, and they come upon Stefan Cowens. Stefan Cowens had been arrested for selling Louis Vuitton knockoff bags in that park. They then go and look at his fingerprints and try to match it to a thumbprint left on the mug in that apartment. They declare a 16-point match. He has an alibi. The cop originally doesn't identify him. The three black people in the home who were with him for 20 minutes say, he ain't the guy. 16-point fingerprint match. He is convicted in a nanosecond. Right? Stefan spends a number of years in jail. Innocence Project in New England and in New York gets his case, and we start doing DNA testing. We get sweat from the hat, the headband left in the park. DNA profile male. We get saliva that was taken from the rim of the cup. It was a good thing that they did. DNA profile male. We get sweat and skin cells from the sweatshirt. DNA profile male. All the DNA profiles match each other. None of them are from Stefan Cowens. The prosecutor says, whoa, we got a problem. Let's go back and look at that print. Sure enough, they look at the print. It ain't his. They then reinvestigate the people in the lab. They do a forensic audit the proper way. They're fired. They bring in new people to do fingerprinting, and they change their whole system. Who knows the name Brandon Mayfield? Anybody in this room ever hear the name Brandon Mayfield? You do? Okay. Maybe you should. Maybe this will remind you. Do you remember the Madrid train bombing? Big bomb. Al-Qaeda blows up a train in Madrid. There's blue plastic on the bomb. They get fingerprints off the blue plastic. It's sent out over Interpol. We have a system in this country called AFIS, Automatic Fingerprint Identification Search. The prints are put into AFIS and they spit out a number of possible matches. Individual FBI examiner begins to look at them. They claim, I'm suspicious, that they do nothing about Brandon Mayfield, the man they matched. Brandon Mayfield is a lawyer in Portland, Oregon. He is Muslim. He converted to being a Muslim after marrying a Muslim wife. He had done marital relations work for a number of individuals who were known to then the government claim to be members of Al-Qaeda in the Portland, Oregon area. They claim they knew nothing about Mayfield. They just matched his fingerprint to a set of prints they had when he had been in the United States military. The government declares, the FBI, there's a 15-point fingerprint match. He's picked up as a material witness. They do sneak and peek warrants in his house. God knows what they did in terms of investigation, and who can blame him? They thought he was the guy that was involved in the bomb in Madrid. My favorite part of the story is Mayfield says, I have nothing in a passport. I can barely make ends meet. I'm a single practitioner. How did I get out of the country? Right? But they say it's him. A judge then asks public defender, federal defender, represent him, gets an independent expert. He looks at the prints. He says, oh my God, the FBI's right. It's a 15-point match. But the Spanish authorities disagree. The Spanish authorities say, we don't think this is a match. We see certain points of discrepancy. We don't think it's Mayfield's print. The FBI says, well, we think they're wrong. They fight about it. Spanish continue looking. They find an individual. They look at his prints. He's got evidence against him that he's a known member of Al-Qaeda. They say, this is the guy. FBI looks at it, says, you're right. We made a mistake. Mayfield is let go. They apologize. 15-point incorrect match. You go to the FBI website and you'll see a report by a man named Robert Stacy who says, we had examiner bias. We took a look at the prints. There was a lead examiner. He said it was a match. The subordinates were afraid to disagree with him. Remember what Gary Wells has taught us about blind administration of photo eraser lineups? Double-blind studies, isn't that the way we do independent readings in science? All of you in social science or the hard science, isn't that the way we do it? Why weren't they doing the fingerprints that way, or shouldn't they have been? What is the problem with this methodology? Don't we need to study it? Yes, we do. Now everybody acknowledges it, because Mayfield was mistakenly identified by that print, and that is a very big deal indeed. So, fingerprints, bite marks, microscopic hair comparison, a whole group of forensic arrays, even in terms of their basic validation, have to be re-examined. We need independent entities to oversee and accredit laboratories and get it right. So I'm going to end my talk right now. I'm going to take your questions. I am not unaware of the fact that this is the 10th year, October 3rd, 10 years ago, O.J. Simpson was acquitted. Many of you may ask me about that. I'll save you a little time on that one. I don't think very much good came out of the O.J. Simpson case for the American criminal justice system. I particularly despise and abhor the cottage industry of pundits and the tendency of cable television to sensationalize the coverage of trials, even when they don't get cameras in the courtroom, because they know people will pay attention to celebrity cases or particularly salacious cases. And I think it's really sort of distorted the way the system works. The only good thing that I could see out of the Simpson case for the criminal justice system, the silver lining, is that the prosecutors who did the DNA evidence and the forensics in that case, Woody Clark, who's now a judge in San Diego, and Rock Harmon from Alameda County, and others, have worked with us hand in hand because they absolutely agreed with the critique we made of the way the evidence was handled and tested by the crime labs and by the people at the crime scene. It was all done wrong. We've worked together, working on federal commissions. We've sent out pamphlets. What every law enforcement officer ought to know about DNA testing: always change your gloves, never put anything wet into a plastic bag, don't contaminate the evidence. We have to have techniques to gather it correctly so that we can really take advantage of these 21st century technologies we have in our forensic labs. So if that helps, you can ask me any question you want about that. You can ask me about Louise Woodward. You can ask me about Admiral Lima, any of the cases that you know about that I've been involved in. I want to take special mention that in the audience is Kirk Tofty. Wave your hand. His daughter Sarah worked for quite a number of years at the Innocence Project. They're a wonderful family. We are greatly indebted for her work. She helped get a lot of these innocent people out of jail and has cared for them afterwards in their most difficult circumstances after they're exonerated, and I'm really honored to see you here tonight. With that, I end my talk and I take your questions. If you shout it out, I'll repeat it.
Preference is to use the mic.
Okay. The reason I came tonight is that I just read in Time magazine about, I don't know if it was last week's issue or the one before, about DNA exonerations may get rarer in Florida and in Ohio. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. We had terrible problems in the state of Florida and the state of Ohio. They passed post-conviction DNA statutes, but they put sunset provisions in them, which meant that we had like 2 years or 4 years to do all the DNA testing we could. And of course, we don't have many resources. We don't have projects that really are fully funded in any of these areas. We haven't gotten close to getting through the cases. We still have that problem in Ohio, but you saw that Luis Diaz case?
Yeah, it's in here.
Well, anytime that you get in the state of Florida somebody out of prison who's Cuban and Hispanic, and Telemundo and Univision cover the case, it's absolutely shocking how legislators that didn't pay any attention to you before all of a sudden have decided, yes, we're going to pass legislation to eliminate that. The Florida Supreme Court now for the second time has extended the deadline. The Florida Rules Committee did that, and Governor Bush, who had been very reluctant to do so, issued an executive order saying all state agencies have to preserve the biological evidence. So we did okay in Florida, but we still have a serious problem in Ohio and in at least 16 or 17 other states. Yes?
My question is that since DNA testing, for the most part, is currently in its infancy, if it becomes more popular, and we all expect it will, at what point do you feel that there need to be, or we're going to have a point where we're going to have a lot of DNA evidence that we need to store, and we may not necessarily have a reliable way of storing it? Do you have or know of any processes that are in place as far as storing them in a computer data bank? And if there are, if you do transpose them digitally, then what processes are in place to prevent errors from cropping up and preservation of integrity and things like that?
Well, there's a number of answers. First, when you're just talking about preserving evidence from a crime scene, the most important thing is to have it dried and preserve it at room temperature. So we can go back and look at any item of evidence that's 10, 20, 30 years old. It's shocking, and we can get results. but if you put it wet into a plastic bag and you collected it, a few hours ago, it's going to curdle, like bad milk, and you'll get bacterial degradation, and the bacteria literally eat up the DNA. But another question you asked was, how do you preserve the DNA profiles or the DNA results? That's a comparatively easy matter. Depending on what technique you're using, you can get results where you're looking at different markers, and you can, record those digitally. But the best part of your question, I think, that must be addressed is the issue of laboratory error. Because DNA is a very, very powerful technology that's transformed our system, but the very best labs make mistakes. DNA testing is foolproof. Any fool can do it. And what's most important is your laboratory error rate. The very best DNA laboratories have made serious mistakes by sample handling error. The FBI, Cellmark, New York City Medical Examiner's Office, you name it, have been had problems where analysts were rushing to get through their work, so they didn't do their controls or fraudulently reported that they were doing their controls when they weren't. So there are problems in every laboratory. You cannot escape laboratory error. It's a fact of life. You have to account for it and put the best kind of quality assurance programs in place that you can.
First, thank you for your work. And,
Thank you.
Where does the funding come for supporting your...
From people like you. No, we get it. Well, if you go to innocenceproject.org, there is a place where you can push and say, help. We do get a certain amount of money from that. We get a certain amount of money from private donors, foundations. To be completely frank with you, the single greatest failing of Peter Neufeld and myself over the last 12, 13 years is that all we were doing was cases and we weren't doing any fundraising. And the fact is, if we had gone out and fundraised with some vigor and intensity, which is something that we're not constitutionally that good at doing, we probably would have had another 200 people out of prison. Because our project has grown very dramatically and is being professionally managed today in ways that it wasn't before, and part of that is fundraising. It's just a fact of American nonprofit life. We have to do it. And if you know anybody rich that wants to help us out, or even poor, or middle class, or whatever, go to innocenceproject.org. We love your help. I assure you the money is not wasted.
I would imagine that in some cases the families of the victims in these cases where you've been successful in freeing someone would not necessarily agree that that person is innocent. And have you had to deal with the families of the victims?
Always. And we have a rule at the Innocence Project that we ask our colleagues in the prosecutor's office to send out individuals from victim services agencies to talk to the families and the victims themselves to make sure that they know exactly what process is going on. Because I don't want anybody to read for the first time in the newspaper that DNA has shown that a conviction is vacated. We've had a lot of resistance, unfortunately, to using this technology, even by prosecutors who weren't even involved at the time. They started inventing what we call unindicted co-ejaculators, people who, the DNA didn't come from the defendant, like we said, the semen, it came from some prior partner or somebody else, and a lot of fanciful theories. And the reason I think that happens are manyfold, but related to your question. Number one, sometimes people are afraid if you prove an injustice in one case, the next case that goes before a jury in that jurisdiction, people will say, well, maybe there may be something wrong with the ID, or maybe there's something wrong with the confession, so they may lose the next case. It's very hard to go to the family or a victim and say, you know what, you were the victim of a crime or you lost a loved one. Now I have to tell you something that will re-victimize you again, in a sense. The wrong person went to prison. That's unthinkable. Unthinkable burden to bear. But what's most amazing are those victims that actually have come to terms with it and have united with the people that even they mistakenly identified, like Jennifer Thompson in North Carolina, like Peggy Bernstrom in Wisconsin, another victim that brought about all the eyewitness reform in Wisconsin. That is the most powerful political force. And the Innocence Project has tried to work and has had a very successful coalition with victims, rights groups. There is a woman named Smith. What's Penny? Why am I blanking on her name right now? From Virginia, a wonderful, wonderful woman who was sexually assaulted. Her husband's a police officer in her own home at 12 o'clock, and then Debbie Smith, and then the crime was solved with a DNA hit. And for many, many years, she will tell you, I was her biggest supporter in terms of trying to get crime labs to test unsolved rape kits. In the city of New York, my capacity as a commissioner of forensic science, I went to Howard Safer, who's Rudy Giuliani's police commissioner, and I said, you have 17,000 untyped rape kits here in the city of New York. If you test them, you're going to find serial rapists and serial murderers. And he said, you're 100% right, and you watch. Rudy and I can cut through all this red tape, and we'll get it done. So 5 years later, we were able to start getting through that backlog. But that is quicker than most other people did. And we now have the Debbie Smith Act in Congress that provides funding to type the unsolved rape kits. But there's still an unacceptable number of backlogs in convicted felons who have not been put into the data bank, of people on probation or parole who have not been put on the data bank, most important to get them, and unsolved crimes where they haven't done DNA testing that can solve them, and certainly rape kits. There's no excuse for not doing that, and we haven't adequately invested in using this technology to solve crime. Howard Safer incidentally went into the DNA business and gives lots of interviews saying that he owes it all to me, which is kind of amusing because I used to sue him all the time in civil rights cases for police abuses. You get 2 questions before anybody else gets one? Is that
Last question.
All right. Thanks for taking my second question. Again, as this method becomes more and more popular, I know that I guess currently they are keeping a database of the DNA of people with prior convictions and whatnot. What are your feelings and opinions on keeping DNA evidence on people that are innocent or were arrested for some petty crime and then were innocent? What about do you think they should keep the DNA for innocent people?
No.
Or?
As a matter of fact, we have had some very serious problems, what are known as DNA dragnets. The South Louisiana serial killer, so-called. They spent a fortune going around and getting DNA from people because they believed that there was somebody in the Baton Rouge area that was raping and killing women and was Caucasian. And they would go to people and they'd say, you give us your DNA. If you don't, we'll go get a warrant for it. We'll embarrass you in your community. We'll tell your employer you lose your job. Lots of coercive methods were used. Or they would just say, here, we want to use it for purposes of eliminating you as a suspect. That was the only purpose that they were told. And then they collected all this DNA, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars typing it. And it turned out, of course, that the South Louisiana serial killer was African American, and there were other leads that they did not investigate that they should have and might have stopped him earlier. Then we filed a lawsuit, which I think ultimately will be successful, saying, wait a second, you violated people's Fourth Amendment rights. You told them you were collecting it for one purpose, and then you were keeping it in a permanent data bank. And I think that's wrong, and I think that's going to discourage public cooperation. I, for one, do not believe that the state should have our DNA from birth, that it should be taken even from everybody at the time of arrest, because there's dangers of pretext arrest. And certainly, if you're exonerated, it should not be the burden on you to get your DNA back. The state should give it back. And why? Well, if I have your genomic DNA, if I have your blood or saliva, I'm not just looking at these particular patterns that we use for forensic identification, like a fingerprint. I can look and get almost, your most private information. Do you have a susceptibility to, it's believed, certain forms of mental illness? Do you have sexually transmitted disease? Are you HIV positive? Do you have a tendency towards manic depression? And more we find out about susceptibilities and associations with diseases, the more information we can get if we have your DNA. So I don't trust the state. I have a very libertarian view of this, to have our DNA I think that there has to be a strong predicate in terms of crime solving, in terms of you having committed a felony, and certainly if they take your DNA by consent, saying I'm using it for one purpose, for elimination purposes, it is unacceptable and I think unconstitutional for the state to then keep it for other purposes. Thank you very much.
In one of the early slides,